And when the community thrives, then the individuals who are members of that community are much more likely to thrive as well.
Cannabis truly is a pharmacy and a flower.
Survival comes with cooperation.
Pleasure is healing.
You're being a warrior of the weird.
I'm Lex Pelger, Director of Education at CV Sciences, and this is the Lex Files. Dr. Bennet Zelner was a very successful researcher of economics. But then as psychedelics caught his attention, they pulled him in a brand new direction, away from the more traditional models of the economic world, and towards those based more on community. He realized that he didn't need to keep studying the things that weren't making him happy, and he could switch to the kind of thinking that could positively change the world. Today, he lays out his model of the Pollination Approach to wellness centers that use psychedelics. It's refreshing to hear a top-flight economist look at our current models and what we could do better in the future. Now, here's Dr. Bennet Zelner.
Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here with Dr. Bennet Zelner. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Lex. I'm very pleased to be here, and I appreciate the invitation.
So you've obviously been interested in economics for a long time. I've done a lot of research around that. But when did you first get interested in psychedelics?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I had some interest in psychedelics in my younger days, and I then went off and became an econ professor. I'm actually technically my PhD is in business administration, but my kind of cognitive discipline is economics, and I was working on topics that are more standard for economists and business school professors than the delivery of psychedelic assisted therapy is. And I was feeling, I was doing okay in my work. I mean, at least from an external perspective, I was fairly accomplished. I was publishing in good journals. I received tenure. I had some amazing colleagues at different institutions, but I felt very disconnected from my work and actually from my life in general. And if you know professors, especially those who achieve some measure of success in their field, they're super into what they do. And so I just thought that something was wrong with me. And I was then reintroduced to psychedelics. This is, maybe 7 years ago or something like that. And I soon came to realize that part of the reason I felt so disconnected in my work, or disconnected from my work, I should say, was that I was studying something, the economic system, that was completely dysfunctional. And so that seems kind of obvious to me now, but at the time it was sort of an aha. And my initial reaction to that, I actually found it to be rather depressing because I'd put a lot of time and effort, into my studies and going to grad school and all that stuff, working as a professor, trying to get promoted. So I was kind of depressed because I thought it meant that this realization meant that I would have to find something different to do. And I continued to have more experiences, and I soon came to realize that I didn't actually need to shift careers, that I could probably find a way to use what I had done and what I had learned, topics I'd studied in grad school, to start trying to promote change in our economic system. So it took me a while to figure out exactly how that was going to work. And there's more of a story around it. I won't go into the whole thing right now, but basically what ended up happening was I was starting to gain some focus on how to do this. And then I ended up in New York City, which is where I'm from originally, for a sabbatical a few years ago. And it was there that I started to meet a lot of folks in the psychedelic community, folks at places like MAPS and Usona Institute. And as a result, I ended up having the opportunity to give my first talk on the on economic approaches for delivering psychedelic assisted therapy, or actually the talk was at Usona's conference, and this is a technical distinction, but their focus is on psychedelic therapy as opposed to psychedelic assisted therapy. But either way, I ended up having the opportunity to give this talk, and it really gave me a chance to sit down and organize my thoughts and put them together in a coherent fashion, and that was kind of that was the turning point. And so since that time, the talk went well. And since that time, I've continued to do a good deal of public speaking on the subject, and I've become involved with many of the actors and organizations in the space that want to that recognize that the delivery of psychedelic or psychedelic assisted therapy, the economic approaches that we use to deliver this revolutionary therapy provide an opportunity not just to heal individuals, but also, I would argue, to heal the many of the dysfunctional systems whose breakdown I think we're seeing very starkly today in many arenas.
So before we dive into your pollination approach, I was wondering how it is for you as a professor and someone in academia to be somewhat open about your own use of psychedelics, and if that ever causes any pushback or even comments from students.
Well, that's a great question, and one that I may not yet be in a position to answer. As I said, it was in 2017 that I had this sabbatical during which I started to work more seriously on psychedelics, and really combine my interest of psychedelics with my interest in economics. And I've been increasingly open about it with my employer. We have to file an annual report each year on our activities, on research projects we're working on, and teaching and things of that nature. And I've made explicit reference in at least my last report, if not the previous one, to some of the research projects I'm working on that involve psychedelics. I know that people read these reports because my department chair has acknowledged this, and he seems open to it. I don't know. I don't think that I've been quote unquote out for long enough to know if there will be further repercussions. But my point of view, if I were ever asked to discuss this with the powers that be at my university or any other university, my perspective is that this is a revolutionary. I mean, people don't always like to use the term industry, and I recognize it has some negative connotations, but this is a revolutionary new industry that is being born at this moment. In fact, one well-known psychedelic researcher likened the introduction of psychedelics to mental health care to the introduction of anesthesia to general medicine, to surgery. So this is clearly, I mean, in terms of treatment, this is revolutionary. And in terms of, as I said, if you want to look at it as an industry, there's obviously a lot of money that wants to come in. There are many different players who are starting to pop up on both the nonprofit and for-profit side. And so if the objective, academics ultimately are supposed to be, at least, this is what they say, are supposed to be assessed by their universities according to the impact they make on the world. And I would argue that being involved in the development and design of the economic approaches that I hope will play a major role in this revolutionary new industry, I would think that I don't think you could have. I think that's. I was going to say I don't think you would have a much larger impact. You could certainly have a larger impact in some ways, I guess. But I think that would be. I think that's a great way of creating impact. And so, if it ever comes down to it, that would be my response.
I think that would go over well. And so that's a great lead in to asking about your pollination approach to psychedelic therapy in community systems. Can you talk about how this idea first blossomed upon you and what form it's taking right now?
So I mentioned earlier that I had this period. I kind of come to these realizations starting around the year 2013 about the dysfunction of the current economic system, and then eventually uh, started to realize that I could use some of my knowledge and my position to some degree to start promoting change in the system. But I didn't really know how to do that. I was kind of what I refer to as crossing the abyss for a number of years. Um, it was during this time that I met another person, a guy named David Armistead, who lives in Austin, Texas, and has been, I would say, he's an elder um, in the psychedelic scene and also uh, in the field of regenerative economics. And he and I actually met um, through a psychedelic community that we were both part of. And so David and I, we quickly recognized each other as you know as someone we I think we each recognized and very quickly in the other someone that we could really communicate with and develop ideas with. And so we started talking more regularly, and we were trying to develop an idea for an organization of some sort that could help to shift the current economic paradigm. And actually, developing that organization has been a big part of what I've been up to for the last couple of years. And so that organization is called the Transformative Capital Institute. And our broad mission, as I already suggested, is to promote the emergence of a new economic paradigm. Now, in order to unpack that a bit, I think I already mentioned earlier that if you look around at the world today, all of our major systems seem to be in a state of, I don't know, maybe collapse is a strong word, but it's the one that I think probably applies the best. And at the root at the root of this collapse. So by the way, I refer. So the term that I would use to refer to this state is metacrisis. It's concurrent crises in multiple systems, in economic systems, in social systems. Obviously, today, health systems, ecological systems, you name it. And I think that the roots of I think these crises all have a common root. And it's ultimately this myth of disconnection, the myth that we're disconnected from each other and from nature. And so the so the work that I wanted to do, and that David has been doing for a long time, involves kind of reconstructing the social and economic fabric of communities. In order to give that a little bit more context, I think it's necessary to be a bit more specific about what the nature of this meta crisis that we're currently in is. And as I said, I think at the root of this is this myth of disconnection, which expresses itself in these kind of hyper individualistic values, a caricatured belief in the power of competition and markets as a way of organizing virtually all aspects of human life. It's also expressed in the idea of shareholder primacy, the idea that the interests of shareholders should take priority over those of all other stakeholders in the operation of a business. So all of these forces have combined together with technologies that during past centuries have favored large organizations because of economies of scale and coordination and communication economies. All of these forces have combined to create a pattern of human settlement in which the vast majority of economic power is concentrated in large centralized organizations, primarily in global corporations. And the result of this, this results in another form of disconnection. So there's a disconnection between the people making decisions about how local community resources are used. And you have these corporate managers located thousands of miles away who have no direct contact with the local ecosystems, making decisions about how to use the various forms of what I, as an economist, would refer to as capital in that system: the economic capital, the social capital, the human capital, etc. You also, here's another form of disconnection. You have corporate shareholders who also tend to be a highly concentrated group that's not necessarily local. You have corporate shareholders receiving the bulk of the financial proceeds being created by community economic activities. At the same time, because at the same time, the rise of kind of hyper individualistic values and all of these alienating economic practices that I was just describing have contributed to a great deal of social disconnection, a great deal of social isolation and loneliness. I mean, the UK has appointed, it's so bad that the UK has appointed a minister of loneliness, and the former US Surgeon General has kind of made it his focal project is what he refers to as the epidemic of loneliness. So, okay, so you've got this dysfunction and kind of depletion. So you have all of these community systems in a state of dysfunction. Community resources have been vastly depleted, and the reason, as I was just explaining, is this kind of centralized pattern of human settlement. This, if you want to think about it in simpler terms, this centralized pattern of economic organization, in which all forms of community capital are being extracted or depleted by remote interests. And so the solution to the economic problems that communities face, and also to I would argue, to much of the mental distress that individuals living in this alienating environment feel, I would say that the solution to that is to recenter economic activity at the community level. And so the objective of the Transformative Capital Institute is to support projects that do that, and we call these projects pollinators. So a pollinator, and this is not a term we invented. This is a term from the field of community economics that was coined by a guy named Michael Schumann. I think we've kind of expanded the way that we think about it a little bit. But a pollinator organization is an organization that renews and recirculates one or more forms of community capital. And again, this could be economic capital, human capital, social capital, knowledge capital. I mean, there's a list. A psychedelic therapy center, or I like to think of it as a wellness center. So the delivery of psychedelic assisted therapy using the pollination approach is an example of a pollinator in the mental wellness space. But you can have pollinator organizations in other spaces too. You might have, you can imagine having a pollinator, for example, that's focused on regenerative agriculture. And I could give other examples too. But does that give a sense?
Hey folks, it's sponsor time. The company is CV Sciences, the product is Plus CBD, and the discount code for 20% off is Lex Files. And remember, the top 3 reasons to use that code on pluscbdoil.com. Number 1, I would give Plus CBD to your grandmother, because I gave it to my grandmother. Number 2, I was the biggest skeptic. Then I started studying the endocannabinoid system. Number 3, I know firsthand that CV Sciences is committed to pure science and to enhancing well-being. So when you find yourself in need of CBD from true agricultural hemp, consider Plus CBD, the number 1 CBD brand in the United States. That coupon code is Lex Files, and the place to use it is pluscbdoil.com.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the projects Transformative Capital Institute is doing, and then we can go to how you would see that on a psychedelic approach.
Sure. Well, as I said, I don't even like to refer to us as a new organization. We are an emerging organization. So that means that we are in the process. It's been a really fascinating process. We've spent, I would say the last year thinking about doing some of the things that I think all organizations need to do, really clarifying their mission and vision, but also thinking about how to organize ourselves and how to organize ourselves in a way that is truly collaborative and um, doesn't reflect some of the kind of competitive instincts and scarcity thinking that are, that I think uh, we're all influenced by just as a result of having grown up in the society that we live in. So we have several projects that we're considering as our initial projects. The projects fall into two broad buckets. So one type of project that we're interested in supporting is what we're referring to as local pollinator projects. So an example of this is the type of thing I was already talking about. An example would be um, a wellness center that plans to deliver psychedelic therapy, among other modalities, and also embraces other elements of the pollination approach. And I can be more specific about what those are. I think there are two key distinguishing attributes. One is that wellness centers that are enacting or embodying the pollination approach recognize the intrinsic interdependence between individual and community wellness, and so they're focused on healing at both levels, because individual and community healing complement one another. The second distinguishing attribute, as is implied by the name or the term wellness center, is that um, these organizations that are focused not on the management of disease, but on the production of wellness. All right, so I think it's important, just to give some context, to think about what the current approach to mental health care is, and this is an approach that I often refer to as the disease management approach. Under this approach, mental illness or mental distress is thought of as being akin to a physiological disease. So it's thought of as a bunch of symptoms, and often thought of as a bunch of chronic symptoms that are rooted in something that's wrong with the individual. And so this approach de-emphasizes psychosocial influences, so the individual traumas that a person might have experienced or the social context that they live in. And it provides a basis. I mean, in the same way that we use medications, that we use drugs to treat physiological diseases, it provides a strong basis for treating uh, different forms of mental distress, also using pharmaceuticals. And so, if you're depressed, the general prescription is to go take SSRIs, which are the main class of antidepressants, often for an extended period of time. Therapies de-emphasized, etc. So this view of mental distress, I mean, first of all, it's been tremendously profitable for corporate shareholders. You basically are creating you're creating a huge population of consumers who may take these drugs every day for the rest of their lives, if not, or at least for years on end. So it's a very profitable approach financially. But in terms of actually treating mental illness, I mean, there's no doubt that for some forms of mental illness, some drugs can be remarkably effective. But if you look at um, the most commonly prescribed category of drug, which is antidepressants, the the evidence on their efficacy is actually very limited. Um, yeah, the most recent meta study that I've seen finds that they're effective for a very small portion of people who receive them for a limited period of time. And there's also a lot of additional research coming out now showing that not only are they of limited effectiveness, but they also, in many cases, leave you worse off. You feel worse after you stop taking them due to something called oppositional tolerance. So so the current paradigm isn't isn't working very well. Another measure you can look at, if you look at national rates of depression and addiction, those haven't come down either. And if you look at things like there's a commonly used measure called disability adjusted life years. It's the number of years of life that are lost due either to death or during which a person is disabled due to a specific cause. So country level uh, country level measures of disability adjusted life years due to depression and addiction have also stayed flat. So the reason, so my point here is obviously in part to suggest that the current paradigm isn't working very well to treat mental distress. But there's another point I want to make as well that I think is really important for understanding how we might come up with a better approach. And the point is that this kind of hyper individualistic orientation of the disease management approach, this orientation that views mental distress as being this individualized phenomenon that's just like a physical disease. That same sort of hyper individualism is infused through almost all of our economic and social practices these days. So this is what I was talking about a little bit earlier. This is all part of this kind of what I refer to as a pattern of human settlement or a pattern of economic organization, in which people are tremendously alienated as a result of these hyper individualistic values and the business practices that reflect these hyper individualistic values. So if you want to treat uh, mental distress, in many cases, it doesn't really make sense to treat it using a delivery of care model that carries or embodies the same types of um, values and represents the same type of practice that is contributing to a lot of people's mental distress in the first place. Okay, so that's the current system. So the solution to that is to reconnect people, to reconnect them to community systems. So um, one of the primary channels through which psychedelic assisted therapy has been shown to produce healing, and there's some great work on this subject by Roz Watts and her colleagues, which is definitely worth taking a look at. One of the main channels through which they produce healing is by creating openness to connection, or reconnection, perhaps connection to oneself, to others, and to nature. If you provide someone with a psychedelic experience, and let's say they have a great experience, they're feeling really open, they really want to reconnect, and then you thrust them back into the same alienating environment that may have been contributing to some of their mental distress in the first place, you're really reducing the chances that the positive effects of the treatment are going to be sustained. And there's not a lot of clinical evidence to show that yet. But that's my firm belief. And so the pollination approach explicitly attempts to leverage this window of openness to connection that people who have received psychedelic or psychedelic assisted therapy feel following therapy. So it leverages this window of reconnection to reconnect them to community systems. So to reconnect them to cultural institutions in the community, to business organizations, to educational institutions, to whatever organizations in the community or systems in the community they're drawn towards. And this makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because people who are suffering from major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder are often the most disconnected people of all. So by reconnecting them, but by helping them reconnect, you are really taking full advantage of the healing potential of psychedelic therapy, and in doing so, you're also contributing to the healing of the community itself. The more you can reconnect people to community systems, the more vibrant these systems become. Remember, a lot of these communities, as we were discussing earlier, have been hollowed out. They've been they've had various various forms of community capital extracted and depleted as a result of remote ownership and management of the community's resources. So if you can start to rebuild, or if we want to use kind of a haughtier term, recomplexify a community's social networks, you can also start to revitalize its economic networks, and the community can start to function in a more the community can ideally start to thrive again. And when the community thrives, then the individuals who are members of that community are much more likely to thrive as well. So a wellness center that embodies the pollination approach is a multimodal community institution that seeks to produce both individual and community wellness. And this is really its mission. And what that reminds me of, you know, that's a very ancient type of tradition. I mean, there are a lot of indigenous communities in which communal practices involving plant medicines are sites of both individual and community healing, and it's deeply incorporated into the culture. Um, in fact, I would go so far as to say that every major change that life confronts people with in such a culture um, is marked by a ceremony involving the use of plant medicines. And if you want to think about that from a more Western scientific perspective, it makes a lot of sense, because what psychedelics do is they increase neuroplasticity. So, approaching the changes that life confronts us with increased neuroplasticity sounds like a winning strategy to me. In terms of the pollination approach and what that actually looks like on the ground, yeah. So I think that well, a couple of points. One is there is a phrase that my colleague David Armistead likes to use, in which we employ as kind of one of our uh, one of our taglines for the Transformative Capital Institute, and that is uh, learning globally and living locally. So, on the one hand, the specific structure of the wellness center itself um, that is inherently local. It has to be, because different communities have different cultural traditions, different histories, different patterns of collective trauma. So there are a whole bunch of reasons why this has to be an inherently local kind of operation. On the other hand, I think there are global principles, and I feel comfortable regarding these principles as global, because they're rooted in nature. So they're biomimetic principles. So one of these, which we've already been talking about, and which is really the core principle underlying the pollination approach, is the principle of recirculation. So a pollinator, I don't remember if I said it exactly this way before, so I want to make sure I do now. A pollinator is an organization that renews and recirculates community resources. Now, we've already talked about what that means in terms of the approach to treatment. When you reconnect people to community systems, what you're basically doing is you're putting them back into circulation. So again, this is kind of stark economic speak, but you're renewing and recirculating human resources. Wellness centers are people pollinators. But it's not enough just to stop at the treatment modality. If you really want to heal the dysfunctional community systems that we were discussing previously, and therefore contribute to the healing of individuals, you need to have an approach that extends to all facets of the organization. So when you mention terms like stakeholder inclusivity and distributed local ownership, now what we're talking about is the governance of the organization. And so what you would not want these community wellness centers to be owned by remote corporate interests, because doing so would be, because if that were the case, you'd be recreating the problem that you're a big part of the problem that you're trying to solve. Um, a lot of the financial proceeds would be extracted out of the community. Decisions about the operation of the center would be made on, more on a remote basis by people who aren't in direct contact um, with the community and its members. So local ownership and operation are critical. And so, but the idea, what stakeholder inclusivity specifically refers to, is the idea that uh, the that the various stakeholders in a given organization should have some say in decision making about how that organization operates. And so that would include not just those who provide the financial capital, the entrepreneurs, that would also include the therapists. And, I think it would also, you'd also want to include groups in the community. Again, the idea is for these wellness centers to be true community institutions in every, in every sense of that term. So you want all these different stakeholder groups involved in the decision making. Distributed local ownership, that refers to the idea that in addition to being involved in the decision making, that the that members of the community have an ownership stake in the center too, or in the wellness center as well. And there are different ways that you could achieve that. If you want the ownership stakes to be as widely distributed as possible in the community, you might want to employ some sort of cooperative structure. So when the so a wellness center that embodies the pollination approach, by its nature, will produce widespread social and economic returns. By distributed local ownership through, as I suggested, perhaps a co-op structure, is a way of ensuring that some of the financial proceeds that are directly created by the wellness center also flow into the pockets of people in the broader community. And this isn't just to be nice. This is actually good for the economic health of the entire community, because when the financial proceeds that are generated at any sort of business enterprise in the community are recirculated locally rather than being extracted by remote shareholders, they're available to fund other local investment and possibly consumption. So these sorts of ideas, stakeholder inclusivity, distributed local ownership, these stand in direct contrast to the ideal of shareholder primacy that's deeply embedded in the established paradigm. They're basically direct alternatives to structures where all of the flows go from bottom to top, or from periphery to center. And since that time, I've become very, very enthusiastic about another kind of set of governance arrangements that go under the term of steward ownership. And there's an amazing organization. It's called Purpose, and their website is purpose-economy.org, that has developed this idea of steward ownership. And it's not just an idea; it's actually a set of structures that can be used. So basically, what they've done is they've figured out ways to use elements of the existing system to set up governance structures for organizations that achieve two main purposes. And one is that these structures prioritize purpose over profits, which is the opposite of shareholder primacy, where shareholder profits are primary. And these structures also, the other objective that they achieve is they ensure that decision making about in enterprises or in organizations operations and activities is the decision making is done by those who are directly engaged in those activities versus, again, remote shareholders or managers at corporate HQ in some distant place. So I just wanted to throw that. I just wanted to make sure I made mention of that because I think cooperatives are one possible structure. And they're not exclusive from steward ownership structures, but I think that a lot of the ideas that the steward ownership folks have come up with hold a great deal of promise. And I'm also, in fact, there are a lot of, there are quite a few clinics and other organizations that have either started up or are planning to start up in the psychedelic space that are embracing many of these steward ownership ideas. So I think I think we'll be hearing a lot more about it.
Thank you for sharing on that one. It was new to me. The other one that I read in your writing that was new that intrigued me was a capped return structure, where it sounds like there are investors, but if they get their money back, is the hope it's a certain amount that they get back and they know what they're getting and they know the money also goes to help the community. And that sounds like a really intriguing structure as well.
Yeah, so I think there are I think there are a bunch of different options for creating structures like this. And with some of so I'll talk about, I guess, two specific ideas. So first, some of the inspiration for this comes from the existing field of venture finance, where there's a longstanding problem in which entrepreneurs you'll have an entrepreneur who will found a business, and they'll have they'll have a mission for that business that isn't just making as much money as possible. That they have a more substantive mission for the business, and at some point they'll want to acquire some external capital in order to grow the business, and so they go to kind of traditional markets for venture finance, like private equity or VC, and they often end up in situations where the desires or demands of the external investors they take on end up pulling them off of their mission. And so so that same type of hazard exists in this context. So we have these clinics we might have some clinics that want to start up wellness centers. And as I was discussing earlier, the idea is ultimately for these to be locally owned and operated and to recirculate, financial proceeds within the community. But they need seed capital. And the question is, how do they get that seed capital and on what terms? And no matter how good the intentions of a wellness center's founder might be, if in order to raise seed capital, they enter into kind of a conventional financing arrangement, it seems to me very likely that investor pressures are ultimately going to pull them off mission. And the reason for that is very simple. The reason for that, and I hope what I said earlier gave some illustration of this. The reason for that is that producing wellness doesn't necessarily maximize concentrated financial profit for corporate shareholders. I mean, producing wellness does, I think, have widespread economic and social returns, but there are many, I can think of many specific examples where maximizing shareholder profit and producing wellness are in direct conflict. I mean, you think about the disease management approach to mental health care. This is an approach that really seems designed to, again, maximize profits for corporate shareholders, regardless of its efficacy or, in many cases, lack of efficacy for treating some forms of mental distress.
So the last question I wanted to ask is, if we had a large fund of seed money here that we could give you to help fund one of these clinics, what would it look like? Where, if you were going to put one right around where you live now, how would you spend the money initially, and how would you want to see it outreaching to the community?
All right. Well, I mean, just on a practical level, obviously, finding a facility and things of that nature would be first order. But I would think that we want to spend a lot of it on. So the big bottleneck right now, or what will be the big bottleneck once legalization occurs, is trained therapists. And so I think you'd want to spend a lot of a significant amount of seed capital on training therapists to do psychedelic assisted therapy. So that's kind of one bucket. I think the other thing you'd want to do, and it's possible that this next one is going to be taken care of by some other organizations that may come into the space, but I think you'd want to make sure that you set up some type of a fund to create access for people who would not otherwise be able to afford to receive psychedelic therapy. There's a real risk, and there's a lot of talk about this in the field right now. There's a real risk that, at least initially, a lot of the people who receive therapy could be relatively well-off people who don't come from traditionally excluded groups. And so I think that ensuring that you could treat everybody who wanted treatment, versus just a handful of people who are better able to afford it, would be another great use of the seed money. A lot of what you want to do to set one of these wellness centers up wouldn't necessarily involve financial capital. It would involve building social capital. And so I think it would be critical to go out into the community and start creating relationships with various organizations in the community, business organizations, cultural organizations, educational organizations, ideally religious organizations. Start creating relationships with them for a couple of reasons. One is that once these organizations kind of see what you're doing and support your mission, that's going to create a channel of access, especially in communities where people might be skeptical of psychedelic therapy because psychedelics were illegal for so long, and the war on drugs and all this kind of stuff. But the other equally important function that building this social capital, creating this social capital would serve, is that you'd be able to use these partnerships with community organizations to help reconnect people who've received treatment to the community, to reconnect them to community systems. So it's actually so the development of this social capital is absolutely critical to the pollination approach. And it's an ongoing process. It's not something you just do once at the beginning, but I think it's important to call it out because we tend to be very focused on financial capital, and obviously financial capital is important in this system for starting an enterprise. But we tend not to pay as much heed to the importance of different forms of soft capital, including social capital. So I wanted to call that out. So we're talking about different types of financing structures for wellness centers embodying the pollination approach. And I think there are lots of interesting examples out there that we could borrow from. One that came to my attention recently that I really, really like is an organization called Steward. And Steward's business is it basically uses crowdfunding to provide loans to local producers involved in regenerative agriculture. So basically, if you want to make a financial contribution to support the business of the guy selling some variety of organic produce at your local farmers market, this is a way that you can do it, and you can do it, because it's crowdfunding. You can do it on a relatively, with a relatively small amount of money. And I hope I'm getting all those details right, but that's the basic idea. The reason I wanted to mention it is the following. So first of all, I like the idea of this type of structure as a way of raising financial capital from the community. So the community has direct financial involvement in local business enterprises. But what's really cool is this. What I heard was that I think in this case, as I said, it wasn't actually investment that the community is making. The money was going to the farmers in the form of loans, and the original interest rate was 9%. And what apparently happened, I heard that the interest rate got reduced to 3%, and the reason apparently was that the lenders wanted to reduce it. So the people who were making the loans wanted to reduce its interest rate, and the way that I interpret that is because they recognize that by investing in not only in local producers, but local producers who were involved in regenerative practices, which are good for the entire community, I think that these people who are lending the money recognize that there were already great social and economic returns being created by these producers, and so they felt like they didn't need as much of a financial return, of a direct financial return. And I think that really the reason I like that example, I mean, it's a cool story, but the reason I like that example is I think that really gives you the flavor of kind of how financial structures might work under the pollination approach, because a lot of it is really, I think that once people living in communities where pollinator organizations, wellness centers, and other types are up and running, they will start to understand and they'll start to recognize the widespread economic and social returns that these organizations are creating. And I think it will help to change. I think it'll help to change some of the cultural programming that we all have about the nature of finance and the distribution of returns and shareholder primacy and all that kind of stuff. So I could say more, but I feel like I've said a lot already. So I'll just leave it there.
Well, thank you for those ideas, and hopefully we can get you a whole bunch of seed money soon to help making these a reality. It's really fascinating thinking. And for anyone listening, again, our guest is Dr. Bennet Zelner. We'll have links to essay and a lecture of his on the podcast notes. He's the Pollination Approach and Transformative Capital Institute. Dr. Zelner, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us today. Well,
thanks, Lex. I really enjoyed it. And and to whoever's listening, I thank you for listening. And this was great.
Until next time.
Thanks for tuning in. To listen to other episodes, check out pluscbdoil.com, listen on all the podcast platforms, or see us on YouTube. Subscribe to the CV Sciences YouTube channel to see each new episode. And if you'd like to buy any of our fine products, use the coupon code Lex Files for 25% off. If you have any questions, compliments, or suggestions, feel free to write me at research@cvsciences.com, and please follow the podcast on Twitter @The Lex Files Show, where I try to keep it fun. If you enjoyed this program, please give us a like on your favorite platform or share a link to your social media. It means a lot to us. The Lex Files is produced by Matt Payne. The YouTube videos are by Brendan Cleek. Thank you to Tina Molnar and Jasmine Morris for the visuals, and the music is by Jake Bradford Sharp. Our sponsor is CV Sciences, makers of America's favorite CBD oil. And I'm Lex Pelger, signing off.